I'm going to use this video to revise demand and supply curves. So it might be a good idea to pause the video as I pose the question and then draw the demand or supply curve that you think fits it and then play the video. So the first one then is a normal demand curve. What does that look like? So you might pause at this point and then play. So a normal demand curve looks like that. And then you will always explain that at the higher price, a small amount will be bought, and at a lower price, much more will be bought. The next one then is, what would the demand curve for snob goods or ostentatious goods or Veblen goods look like? So that demand curve then is actually the opposite of a normal demand curve, which means that at the higher price, more will be demanded. Now in the case of Giffen goods, that's because you can't afford any alternatives, so you end up buying more of the rice in a very poor country. Or in the case of ostentatious goods or snob goods, you end up buying more because the very reason that you're buying the good in the first place is because it's expensive, and it allows you to show off your wealth. The next question could be, what does a demand curve look like when it shifts out to the right? How do you draw that? So you've got your normal demand curve, and then your second demand curve has shifted out to the right. And then the question is, why would that happen? Could be any number of reasons. The one thing we're sure of is that price has not changed. So something other than price has changed. Maybe your income has changed. Maybe you expect that good to get more expensive in the future. That will shift your demand curve out to the right. If your demand curve, just important to number the demand curve, if your demand curve shifts in to the left, the opposite has happened. Maybe your income has gone down, or tastes have shifted away from that good towards another good. The next one then is, what happens to the demand curve of a good if the price of a substitute changes? So let's say the price in this instance, the price of the substitute has gone up. What will happen to the demand curve for our good? So draw that and then play on. So there's the demand curve for good X, let's say, and the price of a substitute has increased. So in other words, a substitute for our good is now more expensive. That means we're more likely to buy this good. So D2, so the demand curve shifts out to the right. In other words, if the demand for one soft drink, or the price rather of one soft drink went up, the demand for another soft drink will also go up. What would happen to the demand curve then if the price of a complement increased? So the price of a complement increased, what would happen to the demand curve? So there's the demand curve for the good in question. And then the price of a complement has increased. So let's say it's two goods that go well together, a games console and the games themselves. The games are now far more expensive. Well, then the demand curve for the games console will shift into the left. We're going to move on then to look at supply curves. So just draw a normal supply curve. So that's what it looks like. And then what about a supply curve where there is a minimum price enforced on the market? So it could be like the minimum wage here in Ireland. Draw the supply curve for labour with a minimum price or a minimum wage of €12.70, which it is currently. So that will look like, there's €12.70. There's your supply curve of labour. So above €12.70, labour will be supplied in increasing quantities. But below €12.70, no labour can be supplied or will be supplied in this country. Try a supply curve with a capacity constraint. What's that going to look like? So it looks like a normal supply curve up to a certain point, and then it just goes straight up. So above that maximum quantity there, we can't supply anymore, or the firm can't supply anymore. So the supply curve then becomes vertical. There's an unusual supply curve for labour, which means that at some point, a certain point, the worker will start to substitute leisure for wages. What will that supply curve look like? So it will actually look like that. In other words, above a certain wage rate, the worker starts to value leisure time more than money. So if he gets paid more, he'll actually work less. And if he gets paid more again, he'll work even less because he's getting so much money that he doesn't need to work. So the supply curve shifts back in on itself. What will happen then to the supply curve of a good if a cheaper raw material becomes available? So normal supply curve. If a cheaper raw material becomes available, you're more likely to produce that good. So you might shift the supply curve out to S2, out to the right. Okay. If there was a summer of bad weather, when we're still on this one, what would that do to the supply curve of a good that was dependent on the weather? So the supply curve originally was here, bad weather shifts into the left, S2. And then finally, what does a movement look like on either a demand curve or a supply curve? So just do a demand curve first and show the movement. So there's your demand curve. And the movement will be the change in price. So in other words, from P1 up to P2, your movement is here. And then on a supply curve, it's the exact same. So there's the supply curve, and then you will just nice and neat show P1, Q1, P2, Q2, and there is then the movement on the supply curve. So if price changes, then that's a movement, and if anything other than price changes, that's what causes either the demand or the supply curve to shift to either the left or the right.